Hello, and thank you for joining us for tonight's event. My name is Kim, and I'm one of the event hosts here at Powell's Books. Before we begin, I wanted to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website, powells.com. Tonight, we're honored to welcome David Biespiel in conversation with David Naimon. David Biespiel is a contributing writer at the New York Republic, the New Yorker, Poetry, Politico, and Slate. He is the author of 6 collections of poetry, 3 books of nonfiction, and is the editor of 2 anthologies. His most recent books include Republic Cafe and The Education of a Young Poet. He is poet in residence at Oregon State University, a core faculty member in the Rainier Writers Workshop MFA program, and founder of the Attic Institute of Arts and Letters. In A Place of Exodus, Home, Memory, and Texas, Biespiel tells the story of the rise and fall of a Jewish boyhood in Texas and his search for the answers to his life's central riddle. Are we ever done leaving home? David will be joined in conversation by David Naimon. Naimon's work has appeared or is forthcoming in Orion, Tin House, Boulevard, AGNI, Black Warrior Review, and elsewhere. It has garnered a Pushcart Prize, been reprinted in the Best Small Fictions, and cited in Best American Essays and Best American Travel Writing. Naimon is the co-author with Ursula K. Le Guin of Ursula K. Le Guin, Conversations on Writing, which won the 2019 Locus Award in Nonfiction, and it was also a Hugo Award finalist. He lives in Portland, Oregon, where he hosts the literary radio broadcast and podcast Between the Covers. This evening's event will include a Q&A. Please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to ask a question. As well, if someone has typed a question that you'd also like to know the answer to, please consider upvoting that particular question. Most importantly, please consider supporting David Biespiel and Powell's by purchasing a copy of A Place of Exodus. A link to buy the book will be shared in the chat this evening. Now, please welcome David Biespiel and David Naimon this evening. Thank you for being here.
Hi, David.
Hey, David. Great to see you, as ever.
So this is the third time that we've spoken publicly as a conversation. And the first 2, this is actually the third time we've talked about books of prose by you, even though people probably most know you as a poet. And the second time we talked about your first memoir, Education of a Young Poet, which touches on or hints at the story of the book we're talking about today. And when we talked, I made some mistaken assumptions about what your life in Texas as a Jewish person was like, comparing it to my life as a Jewish person in Colorado. So I imagined your life was more like your great-grandfather's life that you talk about in Education of a Young Poet, Harry Borg, who comes from the Ukraine and goes to Iowa, and sort of is the only person there, Jewish, who can understand the words that he's speaking. He's sticking out like I did in Colorado in the 70s as sort of a sore thumb in a very alien universe. But what I didn't know is there's this deep and rich history of Texas Jewish life, and that Meyerland, where this book takes place, is a place where you can be Jewish among Jews. And so I guess I wanted to start with you maybe introducing us to the place, since Texas doesn't loom large in the Jewish imaginary, and Jewishness doesn't loom large in the Texas imaginary. So why don't you just orient us to Meyerland and what we would know about Meyerland as setting?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. What a great question. And thank you so much, David, for doing this. This is not our third conversation ever. You're a really great friend. And thanks to Powell's and to Kelson Books for publishing this book. I appreciate that. Well, Meyerland in Houston, that's something. Meyerland is located in the southwest side of Houston. It was sort of built in the 1950s. In fact, then Vice President Richard Nixon was at the groundbreaking ceremony for the big shopping mall that's kind of anchored that neighborhood, Meyerland Plaza. And I'll describe it to you. There's running through Meyerland is a body of water known as Bray's Bayou. A body of water might be glorifying it. It's got concrete sides, and it's often used for kind of drainage from major floods, which Houston has suffered from its founding. On one side of Meyerland is a synagogue called Beth Yeshurun. It's the largest conservative congregation in North America. It has some 3,000 families. About 3 miles west of there is a Reformed temple, Beth Israel, which is the oldest congregation in Texas history. Across the street from Beth Israel is a Jewish community center with a couple swimming pools and auditorium. It's kind of the 92nd Street Y of Houston. It's something like the size of Dodger Stadium. And my family lived almost entirely geographically dead center in the middle of this neighborhood. So much of a bubble that, some kids, as I wrote in the book, thought growing up that all of Houston, the third or fourth or biggest city in the country, was 80% Jewish because that community was so tight-knit in a fashion, kind of a middle-class shtetl.
Yeah.
That's what it looked like. And a lot of houses, mid-century houses, beautiful mid-century houses. With pretty crisp lawns. At the time, when I grew up there in the 70s and 60s, 70s, and 80s, I left in the early 80s, Meyerland would have been thought of as kind of suburban. But now, given how wide, Houston is one of the largest cities geographically in the world. Meyerland's kind of inner part of the city core.
Well, I imagine, I'm hesitant to imagine or presume more since I've presumed wrong already, but I imagine that a lot of the Jews who settled in Meyerland perhaps had stories like your family and my family coming from the Ukraine, or maybe from Belarus or Russia, fleeing persecution, and finding both America and this part of Texas and this part of Houston as a sort of promised land, a place where they could recreate a Jewish life among Jews. And I wondered if that was always the frame that you had for your story, was using the Exodus story of the Hebrew Bible as sort of a thematic frame for your story, which in a way is I don't know if it's a reverse Exodus, but we'll talk about how your story troubles this question of Exodus. But was Exodus always the obvious choice, or were you trying some other possible ways to engage with how to tell your story?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, the Exodus had a couple moving parts as a metaphor. One is, as the epigraph of the book reads, I'll just read that out loud because it's very brief. These are the names of the children of Israel which came into Egypt. And my sense of Exodus in the title, and Meyerland as a place of Exodus, is that came into Egypt and then ended up moving to Texas, leaving Egypt, crossing Jordan River, going to Judea, and then went to Texas.
Yes.
Right. So it was sort of a continuation of that narrative, is one way of looking at it. And another reason was the rabbi, who's sort of one of the starring figures in the book, used to organize a reenactment of the Exodus, which was all the kids that belonged to the congregation, the children of Israel, if you will, gathered at the synagogue and marched along the bayou, down in the bayou. That was our Red Sea for the day, and all the 3 miles from the synagogue all the way to the promised land of the Jewish Community Center, where the men's club was waiting with bagels and lox and juice. So that was another Exodus motif in the book. And the other thing is the, kind of undercurrent question of, is Exodus from or Exodus to?
Right.
And so that was something that I tried to trouble and explore, and I was curious about. There's the metaphor, and then there's trying to apply the metaphor to one's own life, and pushing away the kind of textual meaning of the metaphor and trying to apply it to your everyday life.
Yeah. I mean, one of the really interesting things about this book, I think, is the way it's moving in both directions. Because in a way, Meyerland is your Egypt. It's your Mitzrayim. It's your narrow place. And it's the place you're seeking liberation from. And so, as well as you holding this other space for what Meyerland means for other people and for people you care about. So maybe before we hear a little bit of the prose, maybe could you just orient us a little bit to Meyerland from the vantage point of you as a teenager? So talk to us about Meyerland as Egypt for you, and why there's a certain sense, the suspense in the book, and also the suspense in the book is about what is going to cause the rupture that's going to cause you to leave. But there's also a sense of inevitability that if it doesn't happen now, it's going to happen. Mm-hmm. And how is it going to happen? Yeah. So why is that so? What's going on with you as you come into your own as a person and being there?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I felt trapped growing up there, and many people who knew me could perceive that in me, including family. I felt that the cultural, class, social environments were confining. And in that era, I was hostile to them, as any budding bohemian would be. So I needed to leave. And my way of leaving both the social world and the cultural world and the religious world was essentially recognizing that I could burn every bridge to everything I knew there, which I proceeded to do. When I went back to work on the book, for instance, and kind of reached out to some people I hadn't been in touch with for many, many, many years. Some were eager to talk and reconnect, and others were not because of my actions. And I didn't really blame them for that. I understood what I had done into my relationship to that world. So in that sense, I was trying to destroy, the world I came from. My sense of engineering was off because I only burned the bridges. I didn't burn the place down. And it lasts, and people have I'm thinking of my own peer group, my litter mates from there. Many have stayed or returned, raised their families there, and so forth. So that was a kind of surprise to me because I became something of a itinerant.
Well, could we hear the beginning of the book?
Yeah. I don't know if that answers your question exactly, but that at the time I was simply thoroughly done. And as much as I was kicked out, I was also uninviting myself.
Yes.
So the book I'll start to read, and the book's in two parts, and the first part is kind of framed from where I am now, literally, here at this house. And it talks about my kind of consciousness of thinking about the past and who I was then and what that means. Now, I have to tell you that I have carried, Texas in my heart all along. That's another side of your question. I'm very comfortable. I'm not a professional Texan in the way that Molly Ivins was, but I'm an expatriate Texan down to my boots. And so that's where it begins. And then the second half of the book is my going back to Meyerland and roaming around and kind of reacquainting myself with the space. So this is the opening of the book. You've asked me to read about a page and a half, so I'll do that. And it's from a chapter called Rubbed and Worn. And the book opens, I never told anyone this, but for a time I thought I would be a rabbi when I grew up. Not that I thought about it every day, but especially during my teenage years, by which time it was already too late. Not what you think of when you imagine the mystique of a deep down Texas childhood, with the cattle and pump jacks and muggy vastness, pine pollen and red dirt, farm to market roads stitching together lonesome towns that get hotter after the sun sets, evangelical radio, Friday night football, Lone Star flags flying over all the gas stations, 80,000 miles of freeways and billboards, boots and belts and 10-gallon hats. But I don't know how else to describe it. Chanting Hebrew prayers inside the magnetism of Texas lore was my open range of obligation, my 254 counties of faith, my book of third and long. Dots and dashes slashing across the Siddur, the Jewish prayer book, were my hominy and grits, my leaves of trees budding in February, my hot bowls of chili, my Davy Crockett at the Alamo. The silky ink of Genesis and Exodus stained the flat drawl in my mouth, more gentility than twang, so that I felt paltry and sensuous. The verses cutting into the violent weather of my imagination with their multitudes, curved tropes skittering across the pages like a two-step, a deliberate memento and admonition of how human beings behave. Since my first religious experiences were passed through blood, nothing went amiss. Even in the 1970s, in Houston, we still weren't so distant from the lesson of Auschwitz that no one cared that Jews were being murdered. Nor were we so distant from my grandfather's shtetl childhood in Ukraine before the First World War, with stories of buying a cow and taking it to the shachet, the butcher trained under Jewish law. Everybody kept kosher in Cherno Ostrov. No such thing not keeping kosher. On Fridays, when it was time to bench licht, to bless the lights, there used to be a man who would go on the streets and holler, "Time to bench licht." Several thousand families gathered in their small homes and lit the Sabbath candles to brighten the way for the Messiah to travel on a glimmering current. With the black prayer book open in my hands, in another era, in another part of the world, when I was a boy in Texas, I too was swept away by a strong current without knowing where it was taking me. Each word quickening, like a dancer who refuses to slip away unnoticed, a folk dance, performed over and over without rest in the face of all obstacles. None of that required getting used to. I was an heir to it. Hebrew was a home that had been bequeathed. It came as naturally to my fingers as it came as naturally to my body as fingers and toes. It would have been weird not to be Jewish where I lived in Texas, or to hear someone announce he was renouncing Judaism, quitting Judaism, with no intention to practice Judaism in the future. Yet with all this, there was something frightening about it, of disaster to come, like a portent of thunderclouds over the lowlands. I suppose when I thought of becoming a rabbi, what I wanted was to give myself a life of enduring myths. And I must have thought to live as a person of faith would purify my principles. I became a writer instead. No great leap.
Such an amazing opening. And I feel like it really encapsulates, I mean, obviously it encapsulates your love of both of these integrated threads, but also the music of Texas. And I wanted to, I guess I wanted to ask you a question that maybe it's a poet's question, and I wonder if I'm reading into this of you being a poet informing you making these choices. But it feels like this book, A Place of Exodus and Education of a Young Poet, both really feel dynamic and unpredictable, partially because you have no impulse to resolve the contradictions that you bring up. So in Education of a Young Poet, it feels like you're connecting your poetic lineage to your ancestors, to the Hebrew prayers that they say only to themselves in Iowa, full of Protestants, for instance. But here it feels like your poetic lineage is very linked to leaving your ancestors, and forging out somewhere where you don't know what's going to happen, where your future isn't planned out for you, where the meanings that are going to be assembled are completely unknown and eclectic. And I guess I just is that just a natural sort of inclination for you as a writer and or poet to raise contradiction and allow it to be present with contradiction versus to resolve contradiction?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course it is. Yeah, it's a great question. I had a hunch you might ask something like that. In the Education of a Young Poet, I was trying to tell the story of, and I'm something of an, to the foundation of your question, I am something of an accidental memoirist. The thing I study and where I've put, a lot of my attention in my adult life has been in the making of poems. And then when you're making poems, you're essentially trying to fashion metaphor, and you're interested in the language of the experience. Much of the time, your obsession is in the words of the experience, even at the expense of the experience. In the way in which you tell narrative and tell stories, and I suppose fiction, and also in any kind of autobiographical narrative, I guess. In the Education of a Young Poet, I was trying to tell how I became a writer, and I was using qualities of my past to as a sort of DNA seeding of my life as a maker of the art of words. When I was done, I realized, just to connect the two books, that I had not really written all that much about my childhood in Meyerland, though I talk about it in the book a little bit. And that seemed weird to me after I was done, and a kind of diagnostic. How could you write about how you became a writer and not write about where you're from? You write about what you're of, how you were made, and that produced a writer. But I sort of skipped over that part of the story. In fact, in the Education of a Young Poet, I say once or twice, that's a story for another day. And that became A Place of Exodus, because I had to ask a different question to tell this other book. And that is very much a poet's way of operating, of being uninterested in certainty, being hostile to certainty, and trying to figure out ways of posing question upon question upon question of what you're writing, so that you discover something you didn't know you were going to say that morning, when you started to write. And in fact, I often think that to be a poet is to be highly comfortable with uncertainty in the writing. And I think I went about writing the other book and this one as well, as if I was writing a poem, to your question in particular, of trying to figure out, how do I work on an aspect or quality or a scene or a moment? What's the compelling language part of it? What's the compelling framing of the narrative part of the story of it? And once it starts to open, how does it then close again, right? Or once it starts to close, how does it begin to open again? And if you end at one point, like I just ended, no great leap, and stop, what's the next thing you would say that is not necessarily the next thing you would say? What's the next thing in the sequence of what's in your imagination? And that's very much how a poet works. So that, to your question, yes, absolutely. I wrote these as if I was writing a poem.
Yeah. Well, you could say, and I think you do in the book, that in a way, leaving the Jewish community, especially leaving the Jewish community through an argument with a rabbi, is a very Jewish thing to do.
That's what I am told repeatedly.
And you compare yourself, I think, rightfully to Jacob in the Bible. And I know a lot of people will think of one way you can describe what a Jew is as a God wrestler, like Jacob is wrestling with the angel, or the way so many of the main figures in the Bible argue back to God. And I guess I wanted to use that as a segue into a question about whether you feel like poetry and religion share a sensibility or orientation. And I'm just going to read a quote from the poet Nick Laird about this. And he's secular. He comes from a Christian tradition, but he doesn't believe in God. But this is what he had to say. And I'd love to hear what you have to say afterwards. The relationship between poetry and religion is hard to quantify. Both involve the hidden, working at the borders of the sayable. They share an experiential dimension. Personal religion involves a private speech act, chanting, heightened states achieved by ritualized words. Poems have the mythological dimensions of religion, the hearthside stories, histories, imagery, and myths through which the invisible world is symbolized. So I guess I wondered if you feel like the way poetry places the human up against what can't be grasped is connected in some way to the devotional or spiritual orientation, whether or not one believes in God.
What would be the point of that? And so, first of all, I'm not interested in any argument about that, question about, belief or not. That's my part of my retirement package. That's a very beautiful thing that he wrote. So long as the ideas and the characterizations about what's hidden and what's up to about the symboled part, I would say, for me, that was very beautiful. And it's about talking about religion the way one talks about poetry as a dramatic linguistic experience. And insofar as that goes, yeah, I think I totally agree with that entirely. So the one thing poetry doesn't do that religions are, religions care about is people's behavior. In the social civic sense, in the moral ethical sense.
Yes.
And poems aren't trying to organize people into groups, defending the belief system.
Yes.
Granted, poets have plenty of arguments between the romantics and the modernists. Okay, that's different, right? Between the elusive poets and the nature poets, that's different.
Yeah.
That's about aesthetics. And I think that Nick Laird quote is very much about aesthetics.
Yeah. And Nick actually does talk about the way it departs when it comes.
Yeah. I remember that. Yes. Yeah. And so that's not a minor difference. That's a major difference. And on the other hand, if I'm a reader and I'm an appreciator of words, I can easily put myself into the sort of, I'll just say, spiritual consciousness and accept a poem in that spirit. And that might motivate me in the sense of how I want to behave. And maybe that makes me want to be more alert. That's often, maybe makes me want to pay more attention to my own, inner life. Yeah, that's for sure. And then it kind of crosses the line into what religious poetry can offer people. And I'm not speaking for everybody. I don't want to. Right. But that behavior is a big difference. I've never written a poem to try to change, to try to inspire somebody to behave a certain way, or to be a part of a certain group, or to feel proud of a certain group,
yes,
or to go to war against another group.
Well, I'm gonna ask a question out of order because we have some questions in the chat
Okay.
about Texas. One about what does Texas mean to you, and another about how you feel as a representative of Texas. But so I'm gonna ask my question in sort of the shadow of these two questions, which I think you can also see, David, in the chat.
I didn't open that.
Yeah, my question is: at one point in the book, you say, Texas may not be the center of my physical universe, but it is the center of my cognitive one. And I would love to hear what that means. And maybe that somehow connects also with what Texas means to you.
Yeah.
But why is it the center of your cognitive universe? How does that work for you?
My way of thinking about in my own life stems from one way. It stems from my sense of space. And I don't mean we live in space. I don't mean it that way. I mean in terms of landscape, and as I often write in this book, about the horizon. I don't like to write unless I'm at a window, for instance, because I need to look out. And even though I might not see very far out this particular window, I need to be able to see out. It's important to my sense of cognition. When I first moved to Portland, I really had trouble writing because of the canopy and the rain. I've become much more comfortable with it. And there's a passage I've marked to read that I think expresses some of that, and I could read that now. So in that sense, then there's also the thing that Texans are so invested in, which is their own mythology. And I think one of the reasons I pulled back about in the Nick Laird quote about symbols is I don't think poets are interested in symbols. I think religions are interested in symbols. Poets are interested in myth, in making new myths. Now, every poet grows up hoping their poem becomes a symbol, their myth becomes a symbol. That's about ego. But they're trying to create new patterns, or at least new arrangements of familiar patterns in the way that myth does. And Texas is overly invested. There's a maximum amount of maximum interest in its own myth. And its myth is highly fraught because of, the ways in which Mexicans have been treated in Texas. African Americans have been treated in Texas. Many minorities have been treated in Texas. And also, one Christian group to another Christian group in Texas. And all that complication and all that ambiguity and all that sense of trying to constantly define oneself with very nice belt buckles and very fine, cowboy boots, and a cuisine which, makes me very comfortable, chili and barbecue, for instance, makes me grounded. Just thinking about it makes me feel grounded. Mm-hmm. And as I say in the book, it's still hard for me when someone says, "Where are you from?" not to say Texas. And I often will sneak that in there as fast as I can, as any self-respecting Texan would. That's kind of what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
There's a sense in which that's where you're from, because Texas is so big on itself and so big, of itself.
I do think this is the perfect time to read the other section.
Okay, great. Thank you. So go ahead.
No, and then we have interest in what your return is like, and that's certainly where I want to focus after we have you read this part.
Great. So this comes in the second part of the book. The first part is called The Hard Hours, and this is a part called In the Valley of the Ghosts, and it's about when I returned to Houston to walk around and kind of reacquaint myself with the actualities and the qualities of what was previously of memory. And it starts here in Southeast Portland, where in this household, all things begin. Some days in Southeast Portland, in the fall, it actually is exactly this time of year that I wrote this. Some days in Southeast Portland, in the fall, late afternoons, when children are across the road on the swing sets at Laurelhurst Park, and the light is soft and low and dropping fast, and the dark waits in the eastern sky to let all its bulk down to within an inch of the ground. I sit on the porch as the leaves twirl like confetti and wonder, how did I get here? So many thousands of miles from what I feel I know best. Not Douglas fir or red cedar maples or dim rain from November until May, but a nameless, untold, distant, wide open sky. The past comes knocking when we least expect it, and we feel like we're the child being called in at dusk. Why now? Why so soon? As if called away from the center of everyday existence into some place in the mind where something, you don't know what, has been lost. I like to think I know enough of life not to be hypnotized by the past, that a moment can never wholly be what we think it stands for. And yet, if just fleetingly, we are beneficiaries of its essence. Being an expatriate Texan, like being a retired Jew, has involved learning how to forget my own consciousness. It can leave me famished, pleading with myself to sponge up new life, to become, if not a better person, then more unclouded. What a job it is, because I am still myself. And yet, with all the struggles and breakthroughs, nothing can tell you what a pleasure it is to be so alone. It's almost impossible for people who have not experienced it to understand how much delight I can take from preserving some of the nothingness I have felt since leaving Texas, triumphal and grief-struck with a loony, quixotic desire for the white spaces of a different existence, of being released into the world. I've grown comfortable with the losses, as if I'm always entering a new, peculiar disposition. And yet, whenever I think of home, I see it as a distant horizon, staggering in and out of view.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You could have, in this book, you could have leaned much more into Exodus symbology and mythology than you did. I think, to your credit, you use this frame with a light touch and restraint. But I'm gonna, as the interviewer, I'm gonna lean into it heavier than you do in the book, just to set up my next question. Because the things you don't say that resonate with Exodus implicitly in the story is, it's almost 40 years since you left Houston for good, and 40 is an important number in the Bible.
All the numbers are important in the Bible,
but 40 is particularly important.
There's no number is neglected.
But so Noah was in the ark for 40 days and 40 nights. Moses was on the top of Mount Sinai for the same length of time. And most importantly,
Jesus was in the desert.
Jesus was in the desert for 40 days, 40 nights. And most importantly, the Jewish people were in the wilderness for 40 years before they came home. And a lot of people think the 40 relates to the 40 weeks of pregnancy, that it symbolizes this period of gestation before something new can be born. So the Jews needed to wander for 40 years in the wilderness before they could cross the river and be born as the Jewish people. And you discovered in some boxes some early attempts that you made in verse to work on this same material that you never brought to publication. And then when I think of that, I imagine what happens when you wait 40 years. What is able to happen to gestate that story for 40 years that allows you to write it differently in a way that feels satisfying to you? Because there's a lot of tenderness in this book towards the things that you ultimately fully reject. So I was hoping you could talk about that distance, about age, about time passing in relationship to storytelling, because it feels crucial to me somehow that you didn't, I mean, not to say that your other manuscript wouldn't have been great also, but I'm imagining it would be an entirely different manuscript. I have no idea, but tell us about the 40 years and why is it 40 years? Why didn't you go back in 15 years and do this? Or why didn't you do this in 25 years? So tell us about that.
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. Distance, age, and time in the storytelling. Well, in those earlier drafts, I did find earlier drafts in which some of this, the high drama of this, in this book was, I was trying to write poems about. And their flaw as poems was they were too literal. Right, I hadn't figured out how to mythify them, if you will. And I didn't have the skill. And I also didn't have the emotional leverage. I know that now. I mean, I didn't think I knew that then. I couldn't get off my horse, in my hostility. And I just don't think that that's, for me at least, a place that I value as a writer. To tell, to write the things I write. Other people, hostility, anger, outrage, indignation, sense of injustice is a place. I'm not putting that down. So I think I just needed to put that material away and in essence learn how to write. You know what I mean? So I wasn't thinking of it in terms of this story, but it kept leaking in. And there's no way that you can't read my work, those who are inclined, over the last, since the mid-90s or the early 90s when I first started publishing. And in 1996, I published my first book. That this story about place and displace and what the meaning of meaning is and how memory is a version of events based on your emotional position while you're remembering. That's been my subject all along in different iterations. One of the things that turned me on to trying to write the story in this near 40-year anniversary was after finishing The Education of a Young Poet, I thought something was missing. And I was curious about the question, not why did I leave? In fact, I think I'd left that question behind. But the one, I think implicit in the question you asked me before is why did you never go back? Mm-hmm. Since you've been carrying it around, and not just the conflict, which I think is in many, many ways in my personal life resolved, but the place, why you carrying around the place as a sense of self, but you never go home. And that was an interesting question. And so in order to tell that, I had to tell why I left, just as a narrative thing. Yeah. So the other thing about it is, David, I feel that, I'm now probably older as a guy, as a man, than the adults who were principal in the story were back then. And in some ways, that once I kind of recognized that and messing around with the material, I began to feel that I had some emotional leverage over it. And over the telling, over the storytelling. And that's distance and that's age, to answer your question. While I was working on it, Houston and Meyerland suffered the consequences of 3 500-year floods in 3 years. And in Houston has been flooding from the day it was created. It's built on a swamp. And Meyerland was built on old rice fields. You know anything about rice fields, they are inclined toward flooded plains. So Meyerland flooded all the time. Our house never really flooded where I grew up, but the streets did. Tropical storms, hurricanes were common. They are still common, but more fierce. as we know, because of catastrophic climate change. And so while I was working on the book in the last 4 or 5 years of this 40-year period, the neighborhood was being destroyed by these floods. That may be overstating it emotionally, but the houses were being destroyed. People were being forced out of their houses, moving away. And a sense that you think of your memory as being intact, or you think of a place in your memory as being intact. As long as you're remembering it, it's as it was. Now, it's as it was in your version of events of the past. But you expect it to remain stable. And then to have your memory impacted by the course of events, by the course of nature, kind of raised the stakes, I guess, to use a kind of workshop cliche for me. And it certainly did for the people down there who know me and were interested in this book, especially after Harvey. You know, Harvey was the worst hurricane in Texas history. It dumped over 50 inches of rain in Houston in a 24-hour period. Thousands of homes were destroyed in Meyerland, and including one of the homes principal in this book that I write about. It's now been rebuilt and raised up, I should say. It was raised and then raised up. So I think people there were very encouraging to me, those who wanted to talk about the book, because they felt it was kind of a preservational document. And don't even say that too is a Jewish act, okay? Because I'm just trying to tell one guy's story. But I did get the feeling from people that this was preserving something in our mutual shared lives. And that's kind of what I'm coming around in terms of the time business. That, you know, you and I have had experiences together. And when we, part and we think about those experiences, they begin to take place and take shape in our imaginations and our memories, which is the same place of our brain anyway. And when we get together and talk about the past, we have this shared memory. But not only that, it's a kind of shared social DNA.
Mm-hmm.
And as a writer, I don't take it as an obligation. I just wanted to tell the story. But once you want to tell a story, you recognize that you're trying to not speak for others, but explore things that are shared.
Yeah.
And I'm just sharing my portion.
Well, I'm going
I
to
don't know
ask.
if that answers your question or not.
No, that's a great answer, and I'm going to ask a question by Eileen, and I'm going to add a little bit to it. She asks, "What was your family's reaction to your retirement from Judaism in Bayou City?" And I just wanted to tag on the end of that. You're revisiting Meyerland, but you're also reaching out to people from your past that you haven't talked to in decades, mm-hmm. as part of your recollection and your reckoning. And I imagine that it's sometimes been awkward or painful. Probably other times it was surprisingly joyous. But could you talk to us both on Eileen's behalf about your family, and then also more generally about, picking up the phone and reviving connections that have long been quiet?
Yeah. Thanks, Eileen. Thanks a lot. I one thing I can tell you is in my family, it's best not to speak for anybody else. But, to your question about, their reaction to my retirement, that's still ongoing. The reaction. In a sense, I'm fully accepted as who I am. I have a very loving family, and I love my family back. They're really wonderful people. They're incredibly smart. They're not. They have very strong values, and they have no problem expressing those values to your face. It makes for a very lively conversation. I think some were uninterested in my decision. Some were from uninterested to highly disappointed, from accepting moderately to hostile to it, and trying to, in the effort, trying to win one back, right? There's a person from my past who I grew up with, who was a teacher of mine, who refers to me as, the one that got away, because I was well trained. I was well educated in Judaism. I was not brought up. No one thought I would become a rabbi. No one expected me to be that. That was an internal feeling for a time. But one was expected to know your stuff, and then to practice that regularly. And my stepping out of that circle, out of that well, has caused, over time, different ways, rifts. It hasn't really broken the kind of bonds. We're a very close family in that way, or just a close family. And I appreciate that from them. That was one half of that question. I forgot the other half.
It was about family, and then just acquainting yourself with your girlfriend when you were a teenager, other people whose lives you disappeared from, for instance. And I mean, one of the things that's remarkable about the memoir, I think, is how convincingly you recreate the scenes as if we're really in the scenes, down to, that's a whole, I feel like I could talk to you for an hour about memoir philosophy and how you go about animating that in your own mind and in your own imagination. To be in a room on a specific day with the rain being a certain way and the color of someone's shirt being a certain way, but it's a remarkable narrative spell that you cast. But and I feel like you really you reanimate these past connections with a lot of love and dignity, but I don't know how those actual encounters in the world were. Picking up the phone and saying, "Hey, this is David Biespiel. You haven't talked to me in 30 years, and remember what I did."
Names. No, people were too close. No last names. They were just not needed.
Yeah,
that's how close my childhood friends and I were, for a time. Memory is a version of events. Autobiographical writing is a reenactment of a version of events. And not to put a bumper sticker on it, but that's one way I think about it. It's based on true. This is based on true events. But the thing about memory, the thing about trying to be a writer, and to answer one half of your question about being a writer and trying to put things together from memory, is or at least my process, is you have to slow things down. And you can't just start writing about stuff because, well, you can, but then you have to draw back and get into that granular level you're talking about. And, if it's a February day that you're telling a story, something took place in a February day, and you remember it was raining. You don't have to know, all the meteorological facts of the rain of that day. Right. You know what a February rain is like in Texas, and so you just you reenact that. That's what you're getting at, that granular detail, and that's a poet's skill. I'm sure it's a memoir skill. I don't know the first thing about memoir. I'm not.
You actually do, though. You did have a quote by Walter Benjamin. Memory is not an instrument for exploring the past, but it's theater.
Yeah.
Which I thought was fantastic. And I think really echoes what you've just said.
Yeah, I love that quote as well. As far as the reconnecting to people, that the ones I've reconnected with, I've really enjoyed being reconnected to them. And they email, they text. It didn't take much to get reconnected because those bonds were laid in so deeply. I mean, it's an imprint we're talking about.
Yeah.
And that's what I mean by a shared DNA. It's an imprint that you have. And I don't have all of their imprints, and they don't have all of my imprints, but we have orientations, meaning I know in that part of the world what it feels like to face east, and what the sky is like above your head. Now, what you need to know is that Houston is incredibly flat. I suppose Houston may be flatter than a pancake. Pancakes have some ridges. Houston is incredibly flat. Because of the winds off the Gulf, the sky is in motion all the time, and not 24 hours, 300 days in the year, but the sky is frequently in motion. There's a lot of humidity, so the air is rising and falling. And so the landscape, if you were, quote unquote, the landscape in Houston is the sky. It's the thing that's changing, and it's mood. It has moods the way landscapes have moods. It's the skyscape. And so, in terms of that's what I mean by the orientations.
Yeah.
The emotional orientations, that's different. Some people I had multiple kinds of relationships with over the years. We were able to connect very quickly. Others, we had one or two kinds of relationships, and it took a little while to, reconnect. But it didn't take, but once the reconnection was there, you had money in the bank. There was plenty of well in the water. You just had to go deeper to get it.
We have a question from Keith. Can you give an example of when you had already reimagined an event from your childhood and had to, or decided to, toss out your recreation because of someone else's account or a quote unquote fact you discovered in your research?
I feel like that's a test question.
I would imagine, you've already touched upon how you're returning to a devastated Meyerland because of the floods. So already, I would imagine if it wasn't devastated, it would already not entirely match with the memories you've walked around with so much time passing. But with that, it's an added level, but certainly there must have been some things that you had to reimagine based on, encounters that you had with people that you called or walking down the street.
Yeah.
Is that not true?
No, that's right. Well, I think not that question in particular, but the subject has to suggest that I'm the stable one and that the place is the changing one. Yeah. Of course, I'm also dynamic.
That's a good point.
And my reconnection to the actual place vis-a-vis my sense of it as the past and who I am and who I was, and can any of this stuff be reconnected, is a dynamic, changing multiplicity, right? Yeah. So, for instance, one of the challenges or opportunities of writing a story, and this is so true of writing a poem, any poem, is as soon as you're writing it and you're trying to reanimate it, the scene, the situation, to your other question, as soon as you're writing and trying to get all the props in place, and what props do you need? I need some February, give me some February rain, okay? In terms of the cinema of it. Give me a playground over here. You're trying to re-inhabit both how you felt then, which is an impossibility, and also how you understand it now, which is dynamic and hard to lock down. And then, the other part is then you stop writing, go back into your life, and you think, well, which me is the person going to Fred Meyer right now? The person who had these experiences as a 16 and 17-year-old, because I'm so immersed in that thinking, or just me, Dave. And so the heart of this question is, can you unite the two? Obviously not.
Yeah, I love that. I feel like we've touched on the themes of both Betsy and Bennett's questions about Texas. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask one sort of long last question.
Okay.
If anybody else has any other questions they want to ask, David, this would be the time to put them in the Q&A while I ask this final question. So the epigraph
look
of
like
your last...
You have a great amount of glee about to ask this question, as if you've been sitting on this question all
No, it's not at all. Not at all. But so the epigraph for your last book by Jasper Johns was, I assumed that everything would lead to complete failure, but I decided that it didn't matter. That would be my life. And in this book, you say, I learned by experience that a high level of comfort with deliberate uncertainty is of my skin, in my eyes and ears, on my tongue. It's the very thing that makes me me. It's one of the things that makes life livable, perpetual uncertainty, the not knowing what comes next. And I love how clearly evoked this deep sense of wanting to forge out into the unknown is, both for you and for your ancestors, actually, but also how both books are very, at the same time, turned toward the past, toward origins, toward the ways this impulse of yours to move out is either connected or disconnected from the place you came from. So I guess I wanted just to hear what is coming next for you. If you know, like, what did this reckoning with Texas Judaism produce as a desire as an artist to explore next?
Yeah, that's a great question and a great framing to put those two pieces, the Jasper Johns and the other together. That's kind of brilliant. I appreciate that. I don't know. That's the point, right? I have no idea. I'm interested. So just to kind of tag back, I wrote The Education of a Young Poet, which was about what happened to me really after I left Texas and went to college, and a couple of years following that, and where I began to start writing. So, you know, the part I read at the beginning about I became a writer instead, it tells the story of becoming the writer. And it kind of takes me from, you know, it's a coming of age story of college, of the education of a mind, of someone in their, you know, late teens and early 20s trying to orient themselves around being a writer. And that book ends, on the one hand, with me working on what really becomes my first poem. I don't mean the first thing I ever wrote, but the first thing I thought, oh, this is what a poem is. I think this is great. This is what I want to be. I want to be making this kind of thing. That book literally ends with my grandfather giving me a jacket. And I allude to that jacket in A Place of Exodus, and 50,000 points for the person who can find it. Then I wrote what you would think of, I guess, as the prequel, you know, to use the Hollywood terms, A Place of Exodus, which tells the story of my, you know, why I left and why I never went back, my exile. It doesn't tell the exile, it just tells the causes for the exile. One of the things I'm interested in, late in the process of this, I started working on what happened right after I got, you know, got kicked out and sort of cut ties before I left to go to college. And I think of that era as a kind of lost weekend in my life. And so I wanted to write about that interregnum period. So I've been, you know, sketching and making notes and writing scenes and messing around with that. And whether that's poems or memoir or even fiction, I haven't decided yet. It's too new. So that's kind of the uncertainty. And it all may fall apart, and I may lose interest in it at some point. I mean, that's really the test of writing something over time and working on a book is, can you sustain the interest? Can you keep coming back to it and asking it questions, and it asks you questions, and you ask it questions, and you keep asking, well, what if I did this? You know, what if I wrote about this situation? What if I wrote about this? As opposed to trying to think all the time about what should I do? You know, how do I tell this story? I have no idea how to tell a story. And so I try to write the way I think people make movies, you know, they have a cast and a crew, and they have a location, but they don't have access to all the cast and all the crew and all the location every day. And so they get a spreadsheet and they make an order and they say, okay, today's the first day of shooting. And what we have access to is the second to last scene in the film. Everybody's sad. Okay, I know we're all excited to get started, but everybody acts sad.
Yeah.
Right? And then the next day you do another part of the thing. So I just try to write where my interests are. And at some point, you know, I pull it into port and see what it is.
Well, one last thing before we end, I just wanted to speak to buying a place of Exodus because I've heard there's this open question since the pandemic. What will book sales be like with these sorts of events in comparison to in-store bookstore events? And nobody knew. And I'm privy to conversations around this because my podcast is hosted at Tin House. And I also know people who put events on at Powell's, like the event we're doing here. And I'm also in like a Facebook group with writers, including some very high profile writers, discussing the business side of writing. And really the consensus from all vantage points is that these events aren't translating into book sales the way in-store bookstore events did. And so I just want to encourage people, this book is a wonderful book. If you're Jewish, if you're a Texan Jew, or none of the above, if you're just interested in a narrative about questions of belonging, of self-discovery, and also just a reckoning around your own past. So the link for the Powell's purchase of Place of Exodus, I think is at the top of the, well, it's at the top of the chat, and it looks like they just put it also at the bottom of the chat. So just think about it. Think about the possibility of a Place of Exodus for yourself or for upcoming holidays.
Yeah, and I'll
Hanukkah.
I'll sweeten the deal. And I think the book is also for anyone who's left home and still has, you know, an interest in that question of what is home, where is home, who they are and where they're from. And anyone who's had questions about their faith or the faith that they were, you know, raised in. The book has, I think, some camaraderie. I'll tell you what, for people who buy a book, that, you know, we'll donate a percentage to the Biden campaign. And not only the Biden campaign, but we'll also donate to the Hager campaign in Texas, because it's Texas. And it would be nice to fire a John Cornyn as well. So that's, you know, kind of my matching for people to buy a book. Powell's, we were talking about earlier, and they'll let us know, and we'll make a donation. The book, I was just told right before we came on from my publisher that the book's been out for 8 days and it's now going into a second printing.
All right.
So I would jump and get it now because it's going to disappear for a short spell while it's being reprinted.
Yeah. Well, congratulations.
Thank you so much. Thank you, David. And everybody else, you got to listen to Between the Covers, which is David's podcast and a radio show. And it's probably, without a doubt, it is without a doubt the most erudite and fun literary podcast in the Apple Store.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Powell.
Yeah, and there are 2 episodes with David Biespiel, both of them wonderful. So definitely check those out too.
Thank all y'all so much.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for this evening's event. It was really a pleasure to host you, David and David. Please consider purchasing a copy of A Place of Exodus at Powell's, and we look forward to seeing you at another virtual event soon. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.